The first level in any video game is incredibly important in establishing what kind of game it is and letting the player know the sort of experience they can expect for the remainder. As such, many video games opt to make their opening section something exciting and memorable to get players talking, perhaps a cinematic introduction to the core gameplay mechanics which serves as a glorified tutorial. Yet sometimes games bungle their very first level enough that it might even persuade players to sack off the entire rest of the game, or at least not return to it for a long time. That's certainly true of these 10 games, which all kicked off with chapters designed to push away all but the most committed of players. I'm Jess from What Culture, and here are 10 terrible video game first levels that made us rage quit. Number 10. Toothless in Whopping, Stuntman. Given that we've talked Driver's opening tutorial mission to death at this point, here's something different from the same developer that's almost as annoying. Reflections Interactive Stuntman puts players in the shoes of a Hollywood stunt driver, and the game's career mode sees them attempting to execute a series of stunt sequences with a high degree of accuracy within a brutally strict time limit. And right from its first chapter, Toothless in Whopping, Stuntman demonstrates a disc-snapping level of unforgiving difficulty. In the opening level, Hiccup with the Pickup, you're required to perform a number of nimble maneuvers, hairpin turns, and split-second action beats with a meager margin of error while a timer counts down until you hit the next mark. And it only gets trickier from there, especially as some of the levels will fail you for missing just a single objective. A successful run of the level will generally only take around a minute, and yet from the start, you'll surely fail a lot before you get through any of them in one piece. If not as iconic as Driver, Stuntman similarly left players raging right out of the gate. Number 9. Peragus Mining Facility, Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic 2: The Sith Lords. Though the opening tutorial section to KOTOR 2 isn't difficult, it is a stamina-annihilating chore that might immediately turn less committed players off. The game starts in the Peragus mining facility and suffers the double whammy of being woefully boring from both a gameplay and aesthetic perspective. There's not much to interact with, the enemies and objectives are both repetitive, and on a first playthrough it can easily take over an hour to complete. Compounding the matter is that Peragus is about as coldly bland to look at as starter areas come in video games. While the intent was clearly to show how helpless the player was, that could certainly have been done in half the time and without such an underwhelming presentation. In fact, Peragus is so widely loathed among fans that a mod was even created allowing you to skip it entirely. Given that it otherwise presents a major barrier to repeat playthroughs, that's a damn godsend. Number 8. The Tutorial, Jet Set Radio. Jet Set Radio was one of the Dreamcast's most distinctive titles, yet it was tough to fully savor the skating game's gorgeous cel-shaded visuals, considering how much of an infuriating chore the opening tutorial section was. Though the tutorial starts off basically enough by teaching the player the most rudimentary mechanics, moving forward, jumping, grinding, and using spray paint to tag walls, it ramps up to asking you to combo 20 and then 30 tricks in a row without touching the ground. A little tricky perhaps, but with some practice not too bad, right? Well, the final challenge in the tutorial is to chain 50 tricks together in a combo without hitting the floor. Given the relatively finicky controls and how easy it is to accidentally touch the ground and have to start the whole thing over, this one can take a long time to get right, ensuring a seemingly breezy tutorial ends up lasting as long as an hour or two. Thankfully, nothing else in the game is this difficult, but it certainly doesn't get things off to an enjoyable start. Number 7. Literally any level, Dragon's Lair. Nobody's gonna argue with the stunning artistry of 1983's cult classic interactive animated film Dragon's Lair, but it's fair to say it's far more effective as something to look at than something to play. Gameplay is centered entirely around QTE sequences, the majority of which are brutally difficult due to the short window of time the player has to press the corresponding button. This is true right from the very first level, but Dragon's Lair is unique in that each of the game's stages is presented in a randomized order, ensuring the game will start in a different place in each new playthrough. Yet the crushing difficulty remains pretty much uniform throughout the levels, so it doesn't really matter which part you begin with. While in the arcade mode, losing all your lives moves the player onto another randomized level, originally intended to stop players from memorizing what they needed to do, the home mode at least lets you keep playing the level until you get it right. Ultimately, Dragon's Lair is an exercise in rote memorization that can actually be beaten in around 12 minutes. But considering the unforgiving degree of precision required from the opening seconds of the game, few made it all the way through to the end without some major perseverance, and probably a few broken controllers. Number 6. Ordon Village, The Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess. The Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess is a quintessential example of a fantastic game that just takes too damn long to get going. The first hour or two takes place in Ordon Village, where players are forced to interact with the locals and perform mundane tasks, like catching fish, under the guise of a tutorial. As interesting as it is to see Link's connection to its community, did it really need to be so damn slow and long? This could have been a breezy 20-minute intro that pissed a few people off in the process, but apparently producer Shigeru Miyamoto was concerned that players would need longer to acclimate to the Wii's motion controls, and so had the dev team triple the tutorial's original intended length. As such, by the time players finally get to don Link's iconic green tunic, they're practically foaming at the mouth waiting for the game to start. Perhaps had more of the tedious activities been left optional for players, this wouldn't have felt like such an obstinate brick in the wall to the real meat of the experience. Number 5. The Battlefield, T2 the arcade game. T2 the arcade game is, like most arcade games, extremely difficult in the quest to part you from as much of your pocket money as possible, and the home release didn't prove to be any more lenient. The light gun shooter's first level takes place on a Los Angeles battlefield in 2029, during the final stages of the war between the human resistance and Skynet. You need to mow down the seemingly never-ending fleet of Terminators and Hunter-Killers while destroying a set of generators, and then finally taking on a gigantic ground-level Hunter-Killer boss, which certainly does not go down easy. The level lasts an unreasonable 7 minutes and requires players to be incredibly on the ball throughout. So much as itching your neck for a second will give Skynet enough of an opening to put a huge dent in your energy bar. That's without getting into the need to manage your firepower and ensure you've got a constant slew of high-impact weaponry at your disposal. Though the entire game is extremely difficult, this first level posed enough of a challenge that many never made it past it. Number 4. An Awakening, Ghostrunner. Ghostrunner is a hardcore action platformer that will absolutely body you from the jump if you let it, especially if you played the game on launch before the developers introduced a more permissive assist mode. Gameplay involves you making your way through a series of perilous levels as fast as possible while jumping, dashing, grappling, wall running, and battling an increasingly tough array of foes. And Ghostrunner takes no prisoners from its very first level, which, despite being an introduction to the game's traversal and combat mechanics, can easily see you die upwards of 50 times before making it to the end. Given that a single mistake is typically all it takes to die, the margin of error is extremely, arguably unreasonably low, ensuring there's a massive trial and error element right from that first level. Sure, An Awakening is child's play compared to the game's later challenges, but it still presents enough frustrating hurdles to progress that some players might simply decide it's not for them. At least the devs were courteous enough to provide a demo of the first level pre-release to let consumers make a truly educated, albeit rage-filled, purchasing decision. Number 3. Mikado and Naraku, Shin Megami Tensei 4. Despite allegedly being designed with newcomers to the Shin Megami Tensei franchise in mind, the fourth game is packed to the gills with gut-wrenching difficulty spikes, the first of which occurs right at the damn start. In fact, SMT4's tutorial is arguably the toughest part of the entire game. The first dungeon, Naraku, will absolutely kick the ass of all but the most prepared players. Given that you've got low health, no other party members, and powerful enemies to face off against, grinding is basically necessary to avoid regular party wipes. The only minor solace is that the game allows you to save anywhere, effectively letting you save scum your way to victory, even if that's hardly the most exciting way to kick any game off. If you're able to make it through Naraku in one piece, you're basically golden for most of what the rest of the game will throw at you. But it's such a maddeningly difficult section that it's tough to imagine many newbies to the series feeling satisfyingly onboarded by it. Number 2. Twilight Town, Kingdom Hearts 2. There are two types of people in this world, those who loathe Kingdom Hearts 2's opening Twilight Town section with a passion, and those who are simply wrong. The game kicks off with a lengthy prologue centered around a new character, Roxas, who's trapped in a virtual simulation of Twilight Town. This section can easily take players around 3 hours to get through, and given it's largely comprised of performing mundane tasks in an empty location in between sitting through an interminable slew of cutscenes, to say that it outstays its welcome is quite the the understatement. By the time the veil is finally lifted and protagonist Sora is brought into the fold, players might well be left sleepy and irritated by the sheer excessive muchness of Roxas's prologue. It certainly has its defenders, but given that Kingdom Hearts' storyline is a nigh-on incomprehensible salad of fantastical nonsense for all but the most diehard of fans, this wasn't the most agreeable way to kick the game off. Number 1. Unexpected Visit, Kingdom Come Deliverance. Action RPG Kingdom Come Deliverance is certainly a game that doesn't suffer the inexperienced or overzealous lightly. Enough that it's incredibly easy to get yourself killed right from the opening quest, Unexpected Visit. Basically, player character Henry is good for nothing at the start of the game, and players face quite the gargantuan task of making him useful. He can't fight, hasn't got any worthwhile skills, and can't even read skill books to improve himself. Yikes. As such, you're best advised to avoid conflict in the early going, and especially during the first quest, because enemies can deal way more damage than you can. Hell, if you decide to pick a fight with a local alcoholic who owes your father money in the first 10 minutes of the game, there's a very strong chance he'll make short work of you. To make matters worse, upon launch, the game had a horribly restrictive save system, meaning you could easily lose a ton of progress right out of the gate if you got killed. On one hand, Kingdom Come Deliverance let players know what sort of punishing experience they were in for from the jump, but it was probably also enough to turn many off in record time.
Now, there's no shortage of devastating moments in video games. From earth-shattering revelations to heartbreaking deaths, these instances are guaranteed to leave an impression on whoever experiences them, and sometimes you can see them coming a mile off, but unfortunately, you just have to trudge towards that depressing end. Brilliant. So let's have a chat about them. As I'm Jules, this is WhatCulture.com, and these are 10 video game levels you knew were going to end terribly. Number 10. Freeing the Tree Spirit, The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt. Throughout The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt, players will have to make numerous tough decisions, with one of the most difficult moral dilemmas being posted during the side quest, The Whispering Hillock. While searching for his surrogate daughter in the war-torn lands of Evelyn, Big G's quest takes him to the village of Downwarren, where the locals are being terrorized by a menacing presence. Further investigation reveals the source of the village's woes to be an ancient spirit trapped underneath an old tree. After talking to the entity, players are then given a choice to either free it or destroy it. With the spirit promising to save innocent orphans from the clutches of the devious crones of Crookback Bog, freeing it does seem like the correct option. However, nothing about the interaction has given the impression that the spirit can actually be trusted. The only thing that's clear at this point is that nothing good can come from this quest. If freed, the spirit will keep its word and save the orphans. However, it will also massacre the villagers. But if the spirit is destroyed, the villagers will be saved, but the crones will devour the children. Number 9. The Mines. Life is Strange, True Colors. At the start of Life is Strange True Colors, protagonist Alex Chen arrives at the scenic Colorado town of Haven Springs, where she'll be staying with her older brother Gabe, whom she hasn't actually seen in the last 8 years. After Gabe shows his sister around and introduces her to the locals, including his girlfriend Charlotte and her young son Ethan, players will spend the first part of the game getting acquainted with the siblings as they indulge in some pretty terrible dancing and have a heart-to-heart over a beer. However, this pleasant atmosphere doesn't last for much longer. Events take a more serious turn that evening when it's discovered that Ethan has gone missing, with the siblings suspecting that he's ventured into the nearby mountains. Given the series' reputation for tragedy, players will therefore be prepared for the worst when they eventually find a terrified Ethan at the other side of a chasm. And just when it looks like everything is going to be okay after Alex rescues the child from a perilous situation, tragedy strikes when a scheduled blast that was supposed to be postponed causes a landslide. Gabe is subsequently struck on the head by a rock and falls into the canyon below. Despite knowing something terrible was bound to happen, Gabe's death was nevertheless a huge emotional blow. Number 8. House Benavento, Resident Evil Village. A lot of unpleasant things happen to Ethan Winters in Resident Evil Village. In addition to his infant daughter being taken from him at the start of the game, he's also mauled by a werewolf moments after arriving in the titular village, pursued by vampires and trapped inside a factory full of murderous mechanical soldiers. However, the most horrifying thing that Ethan faces comes when he enters the home of Donna Benavento. Even before players arrive at the house, the creepy dolls lining the path there alongside appearances from a ghostly Mia set the scene for something frightening to come. The tension is only wound tighter once the players step inside and find themselves solving a series of puzzles to make their way back out. With many spooky happenings occurring, something feels deeply wrong with this place, and this feeling is only amplified when the players realise that something has escaped from the depths of a well. The nerve-wracking suspense hits a breaking point when players are unexpectedly confronted by a monstrous baby in a heart-pounding jump scare before a deadly game of hide-and-seek ensues. One of the scariest moments in recent games, it was clear that nothing good was going to happen upon entering that house. Number 7. Reuniting with Family. A Plague Tale Requiem. Much like in the first game, you control a pair of siblings as they journey through a title filled with death and tragedy. However, it looks like the pair's situation may finally be improving when they arrive at the island of Lacuna and are taken in by the welcoming Count and Countess. Not only did they discover a way to stop Hugo's affliction from worsening, consequently putting an end to the horrific rat plague, but they're likewise reunited with their mother and close friend Lucas upon returning to the Count's castle following their groundbreaking revelation. But just as the group are about to leave for the harbour and escape to live a quiet life as a family, the Count summons you for a chat. Now, given all the harrowing events that these characters have endured, players will instinctively brace themselves for something terrible to happen as soon as you leave your family's side. But nobody could have predicted just how far south things would go. Not only does the Count attempt to kill you, but then she watches helplessly as the Countess executes her mother. Things get exponentially worse when Hugo sees what's happened and consequently summons hordes of rats to enact vengeance. And somehow events only get more upsetting for the siblings from here. Number 6. Lewis's story. What remains of Edith Finch. In What Remains of Edith Finch, players play as the titular teenager as she returns to her family home. The last surviving member of her family, she makes her way through the strange house to find out how each of her relatives died and uncovers the truth behind a family curse. Presented as fantastical vignettes that merge storytelling with gameplay to magnificent effect, these tales range from captivatingly strange to beautifully tragic, with each being as creative and memorable as the last. And given that each section revolves around a death, players know that these interactive stories are not going to end well, but none of them carry the same sense of impending doom as Lewis's story. Working a tedious job at a cannery, Lewis spends his days getting lost in his vivid imagination while he works. As players monotonously decapitate fish with one analog stick, the other is used to guide Lewis's imaginary self through a fantasy kingdom. His imagination gradually takes over the screen as players continue to guide the fish into the machinery. When Lewis becomes completely lost in their fantasy, it's only a matter of time before the inevitable happens. Placing his head in a guillotine to be crowned king, he's decapitated in one of the game's most bittersweet moments. Number 5. Storming Castle Shimura. Ghosts of Tsushima. Throughout the first part of the acclaimed samurai epic Ghost of Tsushima, Jin works tirelessly to rescue his uncle Lord Shimura from the clutches of the Mongol invaders after he's captured at the start of the game. By embracing stealthy tactics and recruiting some allies, Jin is soon reunited with their relative. However, Lord Shimura is displeased with his nephew's guerrilla fighting style, believing that it goes against the samurai way. Despite this disagreement becoming a major source of conflict, the pair are as close as ever as they plan to take back their family's castle from the enemy, with Shimura even seeking permission to officially adopt Jin as his own son. But everything changes during the pivotal battle when Jin goes against his uncle's explicit orders and sneaks into the castle to poison the Mongols. Knowing how much Shimura would disapprove of Jin's decision, it's only a matter of time until everything goes wrong. After Jin refuses to accept his furious uncle's final offer to renounce his identity as the ghost, Shimura has Jin captured and burns the adoption letter as a sign of their broken relationship. If losing his uncle was bad enough, Jin also loses his faithful horse companion in a rather heartbreaking scene. Number 4. Evelyn's Fate. Cyberpunk 2077. Now, Evelyn Parker is one of the first characters who players will meet in Cyberpunk 2077. She provides V with valuable information to help with the daring heist at the start of the game, but mysteriously vanishes shortly after. From here, V teams up with Judy to track her down. After investigating the club where she worked, it's discovered that she was sold to a sleazy Ripper doctor after an attack on her cyberware left her in a comatose state. Even worse, the pair then learn that she was then sold to the Scavengers, where she'd be used in underground snuff films. Night City is a grim and unforgiving place, so when players reach the mission Disaster Piece, they've prepared themselves for the worst outcome. Alongside being full of enemies, the hideout that she's held in is likewise filled with grisly scenes which give players an idea of what sadistic treatment that she's endured. Eventually, players find her beaten but still breathing next to a bloodied mattress. Taking her back to Judy's apartment, it looks like she's saved, but unfortunately the trauma she suffered was too much. Upon returning to the apartment, players discover her lifeless body in a bathtub. Number 3. Releasing Dung Eater, Elden Ring. When players encounter Dung Eater in Round Table Hold, there are a handful of red flags that warn players that only horrible things can come from engaging with them. Not only is his name and armor appropriately repulsive, but he appears as a red phantom, a color that is associated with hostile invaders. Moreover, his frequent references to spreading disease and defiling corpses should tell players all they need to know, and that is to stay clear of this character. But if players go against their better judgment and travel to his cell in the subterranean shunting grounds, they'll have the option to set him free. Although completionists will be tempted to release him to finish each of the game's side quests, nothing good comes from this. Alongside killing Black Bogart, he'll invade players after leaving threatening messages. Continuing to follow his questline by feeding him 5 seedbed cures means that players will be awarded with his armor and the mending rune of the Fell Curse for their efforts, the latter of which unlocks what is objectively the worst ending of the game. Number 2. Confronting Dutch, Red Dead Redemption 2. Throughout Red Dead Redemption 2, players witness the downfall of the notorious Van der Linde gang through the eyes of their gruff but kind-hearted protagonist Arthur Morgan. After a botched heist causes the gang to go on the run, the plot sees the group try to acquire the funds needed to give up their criminal ways and live a quiet life. However, things only get worse when their actions put them in the sights of Pinkerton agents, with each of gang leader Dutch's plans ending in yet more disaster. With Arthur now facing his own morality after being diagnosed with tuberculosis, tensions hit their breaking point when Dutch leaves John for dead and abandons Abigail when she's captured by the Pinkertons. Riding back to camp to confront Dutch, having rescued Abigail, players know whatever happens next cannot be good. The law arrives as a schism forms amongst the remaining gang members, and the feeling of impending doom is all but confirmed when Arthur's horse is killed in the ensuing gunfight. Whether players choose to help John escape or return to steal the gang's money, they know that Arthur's fate is sealed, but that doesn't make his last moments any less devastating. And number 1, Bode's not happy about Talanor, Star Wars Jedi Survivor. When Cal Kestis meets smooth-talking mercenary Bode Akuna at the start of Star Wars Jedi Survivor, the pair quickly strike up a friendship. After barely surviving a daring heist on Coruscant, Cal invites him to join his crew on his search for Tanalorr, a hidden planet that he believes could be a sanctuary for those hunted by the Empire. However, their relationship changes when Cal reconsiders his plans for Tanalorr late in the game. Rather than make the planet their own haven, he believes that it would be more beneficial if the Hidden Path used it to better prepare for their fight against the Empire. Bode is noticeably shaken by the news, with his sudden change in demeanor implying that dreadful things are definitely coming. Those fears are realized upon returning to the Jedi hideout, whereupon Bode brutally betrays his friends in one of the most shocking moments in recent games. Not only does he kill Eno and escapes with the device needed to reach Tanalorr, but he tells Darth Vader where the Jedi are hiding. While his actions were unforgivable, having to fight Cal's close friend was nevertheless a painful, emotional blow for players.
We all hate it when we're having a great time playing a game and then, bam, all of that fun suddenly grinds to a halt in one level that we just can't stand. Now, admittedly, game design is hard, and that's a massive understatement. And as a result, maintaining an entertaining time for hours and hours on end is extremely challenging, so it shouldn't be a surprise that even the finest devs drop the ball occasionally. And from poring over the last year or so of video games, these are the ones that offered up a single infuriating level that left players absolutely spare. I'm Josh from WhatCulture.com, and these are 8 levels everybody hated from recent video games. But first, an honourable mention: Miquella's Haligtree, Elden Ring. Now, this one sits at an honourable mention because I need to stress that Miquella's Haligtree is an absolute beast of a level. I really enjoyed it personally, but the reason that I mentioned that it's hated is, well, it's absolutely piss hard. In fact, those two words alone, Mikkela's Haligtree, are sure enough to strike fear and anxiety into all but the hardiest of players. For starters, Mikkela's Haligtree is a pain in the arse to traverse. It is hilariously easy to fall off the branches to your doom, and the dungeon itself is packed with aggravating ranged enemies, enough that even for the standards of From Software it feels like an unreasonable ask. It's kind of a parody of a typical FromSoft post-game dungeon, a weapons-grade pain in the arse that exists only to torture those who dare venture into it. Number 8, The Sewers Stray. There's absolutely no denying that Stray is one of the biggest fan-favorite games of the year. An incredibly accessible adventure in which players control an adorable stray cat in a walled, dystopian cyber city. But the game's 8th level, The Sewers, is a bit of a damp squib in an otherwise riveting journey. Though moody and atmospheric to a point, it's hampered by the irritation of having to repeatedly deal with massive swarms of Zerks, a fleet of grotesque mutated bug-like creatures which can make short work of you if you let them. You're required to use your ultraviolet light weapon to explode these Zerks, or otherwise make a mad dash away from them. If hardly brutally difficult, it is nevertheless the least chill area of the game, and the part which surely give casual players the most trouble. In tandem with the relatively repetitive environments, this made The Sewers a pretty shocking 20-minute lull in an otherwise splendid experience. Number 7, Singularity Horizon Forbidden West. Horizon Forbidden West was, for the most part, a rock-solid sequel, though unfortunately it saved the worst for last with its utter slog of a final level, called Singularity. After the absolute thrill of overriding a Sunwing and battling Regalia in the previous level, Singularity felt like an underwhelming anticlimax, and that's before we get to the actual plot. In terms of gameplay, it takes around an hour to reach the final boss, Spectre Prime, with most of this time spent listlessly battling your way through enemies to the launch tower, followed by a total nothing burger of a boss fight against Eric. It feels both basic and exhausting at the same time, and that's before we even get to Spectre Prime, an infuriating final boss which represents a massive difficulty spike compared to the rest of the game. Basically, if you haven't done much side content prior to this level, you're gonna have a bad time, and might end up bumping the difficulty down out of sheer irritation. Between Prime's absurd amount of health and the cheapness of their debilitating attacks, this fight and the level as a whole ends the game on a disappointing down note. Number 6, Chaos Island Sonic Frontiers. Sonic Frontiers is certainly one of the most divisive games of the year, some lauding it as an ambitious attempt to do something different with the Sonic franchise, while others dismissed it as a generic open-world bloatfest. But the game assuredly grinds to a halt when players reach the third hub world, Chaos Island, which is a chunky pain to navigate and, as such, far longer than it needs to be. In the middle of the game, it saps Frontiers of most of the momentum that it had. That's also without getting into the overabundance of 2D gameplay and the legendarily awful pinball minigame, which requires players to reach a high score of 5 million points. This is an absurdly unreasonable requirement, which, due to being a mandatory part of the gameplay, left many people stuck for literally hours. All in all, most players were simply relieved when they finally made it past Chaos Island and Sonic Frontiers regained some of its groove, because in a game already packed with busy work, this was the zenith of turgid, time-wasting nonsense. Number 5, The Mines Somerville. It's fair to say that Somerville was one of the year's most disappointing games. Not bad by any means, but a distinctly ordinary offering from one of the minds behind Limbo and Inside. It is at least a visually entrancing alien invasion game for the majority of its playtime, save for a thunderously dull trip to some mines that saps most of the life out of the game in its middle portion. We end up spending around half an hour of this mere 3-hour game traipsing through the most bland environment imaginable, and without any sufficiently clever or intriguing puzzles to elevate this tired setting. For an alien invasion game to spend so long in such a tedious place is just kinda baffling, especially given the infinitely more compelling wide open locales we're treated to otherwise throughout. In a game that already felt a little undercooked from the start, this sequence damn near sucked all the air out of the room. At least with it being so short, most players just persevered on regardless. Number 4, Gian's Stealth Chapters Bayonetta 3. Though Bayonetta 3 was largely deemed worth the wait by fans, there is one aspect of the story mode that didn't go down quite so well, and that's the mandatory 4 side chapters starring Jian. Peppered throughout the campaign are 4 stealth-centric side-scrolling missions which, while hardly challenging in the slightest, feel totally at odds with the gameplay of the main story. The stealth mechanics are so hilariously basic that these levels are ultimately tedious diversions, rather than the chilled-out palate cleansers that they were clearly intended to be. Every time these levels appear, they simply stifle the momentum of the considerably more exciting core campaign, and aren't even interesting to look at. As such, they clearly should have been optional content for completionists, even if the character of Jian is absolutely excellent. Number 3, Part 5, Return to Monkey Island. Return to Monkey Island was a mostly glorious return to form for the beloved point-and-click adventure series, though there's no denying that the final section went down like a lead balloon with many fans. The 5th and final chapter is a rushed confrontation with LeChuck, or rather, not really. See, the level involves reaching LeChuck's underground lair and then working through a series of comically trivial statue-based puzzles, apparently leading to a showdown with the big bad. But protagonist Guybrush Threepwood then emerges in a theme park recreation of Melee Island, and it turns out that LeChuck and everybody else were actually just animatronics the whole damn time. Plus, fans hoping to finally learn what the secret of Monkey Island was were once again left with a non-committal non-answer, no matter which of the game's several endings that they settled upon. Given that few of the established subplots were tied up during the climax, it did kind of feel like an abrupt ending, as though the developers simply ran out of time to complete it. Number 2, Alone, Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2. Although you have to give Infinity Ward some begrudging credit for making Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2's campaign arguably the toughest in the entire series, there is one level where it becomes more of a chore than a challenge. And we're talking about the game's 13th level, Alone, where an injured and double-crossed Soap has to make it through the streets of Las Almas and back to Ghost without being killed by Shadow Company. Without any weapons, you're forced to go the stealthy route for most of the level, sneaking around the streets and crafting items to distract or otherwise incapacitate enemies. But between the enemies' sharp vision and how you can be killed by just a few bullets, it's ultimately a frustrating slog of a mission that becomes only a little more bearable when you finally get weapons near the end, given the abundance of armored foes thrown your way. While short stealth missions can serve as fun breathers between the more typical Call of Duty carnage, and good lord if they relied on that being true throughout this entire franchise, this was long and frustrating enough to kill the campaign's pacing dead in its tracks. And honestly, it never really recovers from this point on. Number 1, the platform ride to Arcus, the Callisto Protocol. Though the Callisto Protocol is a fairly short and straightforward survival horror action romp, like its spiritual predecessor Dead Space, it does suffer from a few hellacious difficulty spikes. And none have given players more of a headache than the set piece at the end of the chapter below, where, while taking the 5-minute platform to Arcus, you've got to survive a massive wave-based onslaught of enemies coming from all sides. If you're ill-equipped and don't have solid spatial understanding of the platform's layout, this is absolute hell. And even then, it's a major skill check for basically everyone involved. Thankfully though, there is a checkpoint ahead of the level's real challenge, that being a boss fight against a brutally difficult 2-headed monster. But overall, this is an inconsistent and irritatingly difficult section that feels more like a failure of design than a true test of the player's competence. As such, it's little surprise that much of the social media chatter surrounding the game is currently focused on how controller-throwingly annoying this level is.
There's never been a shortage of video games that are dedicated to providing challenging content, even if that sometimes means leaving fun on the back burner. Getting the balance just right isn't easy. If it were, then every game that owes its existence to From Software's lauded Soulsborne series would receive the same praise that it did, maintaining an equilibrium between tough but fair gameplay. Still, even shining examples such as those often suffer from an overzealous approach to difficulty. Whether it be in the form of generic uninspired level design, sorry John, there are 4 flaws to this dreaded library, or a reliance on detestable mechanics, there's not an ounce of entertainment to be gleaned from any of these offenders. I'm Jess from What Culture, and here are 10 nasty video game levels designed to torture you. Number 10, The Fade, Dragon Age Origins. In theory, The Fade was an excellent component to Origins' overarching narrative, a self-contained dream world drenched in magic that you'd need to escape using fantastical powers. Sounds fantastic on paper, in practice though, not so much. The nightmare was never ending. Several segments, each more labyrinthine in their layout than the last, required senseless trudging through identical demon-infested buildings and forests, made worse by clunky, ill-implemented, oh god, the mouse form, transformations. Add to that the fact that once you're puttering along under the sloth demon spell, there's no escaping the realm without completing all of the objectives. You're shit out of luck if your warden is underleveled. Have fun getting stuck in an endless loop of death and loading screens. Sincerely, BioWare. Pro tip, when there's a mod that allows players to skip an entire segment of your game, it's not a good sign. Number 9. Rescuing Emma, Metal Gear Solid 2. You'd have to think nobody playtested this particular section of Metal Gear Solid 2, because if they had, there's no way it would have seen the light of day. Escort missions are never fun, especially when the baggage your stoic hero has to chauffeur to safety is a defenseless liability. But even the worst examples out there, take a bow Ashley, can't beat the lengths Kojima went to in order to ensure fans hated the sequel for more than just the infamous bait and switch. Just in case you were worried that shepherding Emma through unending corridors wasn't going to be enough of an inane bore fest in itself, some bright mind came up with the idea to set a large portion of the sequence underwater. Because, you know, having impaired control over not one but two characters in a stealth title was always going to be a winning formula. Number 8. Metropolis Zone, Sonic the Hedgehog 2. Not for 1 second should you believe that Sega had anything but malicious intent when it made Metropolis Zone. Not even an inch of leeway is afforded to Sonic as he traverses the underbelly of Robotnik City. Every step forward is another one closer to death, either by environmental hazards or cutesy animals turned death machines, i.e. badniks. Most of the blame goes to the robotic starfish, who can explode in a hail of barbs when they're in close proximity to the hog. Combined with small spaces and scripted vertical climbs with corkscrews, surviving a hill comes down to whether you have surplus rings, not perfect platforming skills. There are 3 acts of this hell to endure as opposed to the usual 2, and to top it all off, the end of the level encounter with Robotnik isn't a surefire win. You could die and be left screaming bloody murder as game over rolls across the screen. But hey, at least the music's terrific. Number 7. Rock Tunnel, Pokemon Red and Blue. Rock Tunnel, destroying the hopes and dreams of children since 1996. The first true early game obstacle that stood between you and the Elite Four. Brock, you're a joke, mate. Surmounting the challenge posed by Red and Blue's first proper dungeon is what separated trainers from masters on the playground back in the 90s. Remember, this was in a time without internet guides. You couldn't just ask Google where to find Flash. Navigating Rock Tunnel's abyssal darkness without the hidden machine is how many first-timers remember the trek through its cavernous, multi-layered nightmare. Even for those that had the foresight to navigate the Diglett Tunnel to pick up the HM first, making it to Cerulean City was not easy. Endless lines of unavoidable trainers, all seemingly infatuated with Geodudes and Zubats, accosted you at every turn. And if that didn't send you packing back to pewter, the wild encounters did. Please, newcomers, for your own sake, use that cash you earn from whooping Brock on rappels. They're worth every penny. Number 6. Blighttown, Dark Souls. Ah yes, Blighttown, the video game equivalent of hell, where absolutely everything, including the ground you're walking on, is designed to kill you. There are 2 ways to go about infiltrating the fetid swamps of Lordran, the hard way or, well, the hard way. Souls veterans will know that choosing the master key at character creation can eliminate many of the headaches associated with getting a 1-to-1 with Quelaag. But even still, there's no avoiding the decrepit scaffolding and toxic bog between the both of you. You will be poisoned down there, in the depths of despair, hounded by blood-gorged mosquitoes, boulder-throwing mutants, and a sackhead butcher knife-wielding madwoman. But just remember, this is nothing compared with option B. Do yourself a favor and throw away that key that you grabbed from the gaping dragon's corpse. You don't want to enter Blighttown from that direction, lest you get lost in its unending maze of walkways, home of fire-breathing mutts for all eternity. Number 5. The Library, Halo. The Library, the Halo stage that brings all of the classic shooter's worst ingredients together to form an entirely unpleasant whole devoid of fun, color, and creative level design. That Master Chief has the unenviable task of scaling 4 floors of identical grey corridors is bad enough, but then being flooded, pun intended, with a universally hated race of spore-based parasites only adds to the list of irritants. Do you know what would be missed if Bungie had decided to pull the library from Halo's campaign? Nothing. Nothing at all. Its only purpose is to pamper the game's length with monotonous corridor shooting, all while being accompanied with the floating ball of exposition personified that is Guilty Spark. Number 4. Farron Keep, Dark Souls 3. Blighttown, but so much worse. Farron Keep continues From Software's apparent love of stalling the player's movement, although this time there's no quick way around it. To nudge the door to the Abyss Watcher's domain open and get your Ashen One's feet back on solid ground, you'll have to kindle 3 fires scattered about the dank, samey looking swamp, all while contending with the usual menagerie of twisted beasts intent on spoiling your day. Only none of your assailants are required to play by the same rules. They have freedom of movement, and you don't. So yeah, have fun getting ripped a new one by super agile ghouls and tree trunk wielding bloodborne rejects, while your character moves at a snail's pace. For a series that prides itself on providing actual genuine challenge, these sections that feel like they just inject artificial difficulty really come off as lazy and uninspired. Number 3. Tubular, Super Mario World. Contrary to others on this list, Tubular's not a test of endurance, reflexes, or memory. It asks of the player the same as any other featuring the Italian plumber: get from point A to point B. The key difference here being, however, that bar some sporadic instances, there's no floor for Mario to set foot on. After leaving the initial starting area, the mustachioed hero needs to bridge the gap between these 2 points in one flawless attempt. Anything else will result in a slimming down of Mario's extra life counter. To combat the rules of gravity and evade enemies spewing screen-filling projectiles, the only tool Mario gets is the P-Balloon power-up, but it only lasts a fraction of the time required to make ground on the other side. Failing to replenish the timer by guiding the bloated plumber to a question mark block or getting hit by a stray pellet will spell game over. In a time before merciful checkpoints and infinite retries, that's tantamount to pretty much certain death. Number 2. Turbo Tunnel, Battletoads. Usually game developers show a little self-restraint in hurling difficult obstacles in the player's path. Natural development of the player's skill as they learn the intricacies of digital world's mechanics sets them up for the finale, where every concept introduced prior must be combined to ensure victory. Not Battletoads though. In a quest to ensure nobody except exceptionally skilled gamers were able to make it to the end of this one, they made one of the most difficult stages the third of the 13 levels. Though for the majority it may as well have been the last. Nothing but pitch perfect maneuvers would see your poor Toad over the finishing line. God bless you, Game Genie. Number 1. Nightmare of Mensis, Bloodborne. Exactly what it says on the tin. Bloodborne's final act marks the point where FromSoft cast caution to the wind and did its damnedest to stop as many hunters as possible from returning to the dream for the final confrontation with Old German. Nightmare of Mensis isn't torturous. No, that would be sugarcoating it. It's a realm of pure agony where awful gameplay concepts live, including but not limited to stealth mechanics in an action RPG, because those always work so well, cheap enemies, and a hair-pulling boss encounter where victory is decided not by player's skill, but luck. Screw you, Mikolash. As for you, Winter Lanterns, and your detestable frenzy gimmick, you belong in this cesspool of Lovecraftian horrors. Unavoidable damage, especially in games like Bloodborne, sucks, not least when it's site-based and constant. Smart idea, poorly executed.
Now, everyone loves a good sprawling video game level. Whether they be large open-world hubs or maze-like singular levels, there's nothing quite like getting properly lost in a video game. Well, unless you actually do it wrong, at which point you're actually lost and you've just pissed off everybody to no end. And that's what we're here to talk about today. As I'm Jules, this is WhatCulture.com, and these are 10 confusing video game levels everyone got lost in. Number 10. The Foundry, Doom 2016. Unlike other levels in Doom 2016, the Foundry is a massive sprawling level with multiple different pathways. It's kind of a precursor to what id Software would do with Doom Eternal, and thank God they had time to practice with this level, because if all of Doom Eternal's levels were like the Foundry, it would have been intolerable. The Foundry is a massive maze of corridors and hidden areas, every inch of which you have to scour in order to progress through the game. While Doom's detailed map feature does make this a somewhat tolerable experience, and is the reason it's down here at the bottom of of this list, the repetitive metal hallways and winding branching paths mean that you'll often be going in directions that you've already turned upside down. But hey, at least the Foundry subscribes to the progression philosophy of the rest of the game. If there are demons, you're going the right way. So while confusing, it isn't totally unbearable. But the same cannot be said going forward. Number 9. The Bevelle Cloister, Final Fantasy X. Classic Final Fantasy's dungeons have long since held a reputation for getting cute with their puzzles, but while confusing, most of them lead you on a linear path straight to the end, so that you'll never have to worry about getting lost. And then there's the Bevelle Cloister from Final Fantasy X. Now the other cloisters can be their own brand of annoying, but the sliding floor puzzle that dominates the Bevelle Cloister is absolutely maddening. For one thing, all of the magical wireframe hallways of the cloister look exactly the same, so it's hard to memorize where you're going. While the moving panels do indicate to you which direction they're going, which does help, you'll still find yourself constantly doubling back to an area you've already done because you forgot your place. While not the hardest place to work your way around due to the floor puzzle giving you limited directions to move around in, the Bevelle Cloister is still an infamous section of this otherwise legendary RPG. Number 8. Myst Island. Myst. Myst, being one of the seminal pieces of the point-and-click genre, is naturally a master at getting the player lost. The entire island is one giant maze of puzzles and treasure hunting, and there's no map to speak of either, so have fun pursuing this glorified PowerPoint presentation to find where to go next. What puts this so low on the list, though, is that technically every direction is the correct one. The game is open-ended, with every puzzle leading the player onto the others, so that inevitably you will find where you're going. It's just a matter of finding the puzzle that makes your brain hurt the least, and then just going from there. Building an entire game around the concept of getting lost and going exploring is a perfectly valid idea. It's why the original Legend of Zelda isn't on here. But Myst's primitive mechanics and UI make it incredibly difficult to solve puzzles, because a lot of the important objects just blend into the background, making puzzles way more difficult than they were already. Number 6. Deep Jungle, Kingdom Hearts. A lot of folk first played the original Kingdom Hearts when they were pretty young, myself included, and much like me, a lot of you probably stopped at Deep Jungle. It's okay to admit it, you're among friends here. Now this place is the bane of an entire generation of RPG fans, the single worst designed level in the original game, and the reason why Kingdom Hearts 2 onwards would adopt a more flat level structure that the series is now famous for. There are 3 levels to this world: the ground area, the treetops where you first enter the world, and the part that truly vexes everyone, the bloody vine section. There's nothing but identical trees and vines, with each exit taking you to a completely different part of the map. It also doesn't help that the means of traversing upwards to the treetops, which are vines that grow up along the trees, just fade into the background of every level. Getting around this area is nothing short of guesswork, and I hate it. Number 5. Zebes, Metroid. Now, Metroid broke a lot of ground when it was first released, but there was definitely room to improve, and one of those areas was properly navigating the world, because Zebes in the original Metroid is one of the most confusing worlds on the NES. One need only look at the remake of the Planet in Zero mission to see the night and day difference that a few modern improvements on the Metroid formula make to an otherwise boring experience. The original level, on the other hand, was a confusing, repetitive, dreary world filled with uninteresting enemies and identical corridors. While being a Nayers game means that isn't that big, you'll still find yourself getting turned around and going in completely the wrong direction more often than is tolerable. While a lot of it can be forgiven for how experimental it was and how they would improve on this in the future, Metroid's explorative world has not aged nearly as well as its predecessors have. Number 4. Ghostrunner's Story, I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream. I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, by Harlan Ellison's own admission, was made with the express purpose of being a game you couldn't win. There is a best ending, but even that involves all the main characters dying after centuries of torture at the hands of a psychotic computer. Even then, you have to jump through a ton of hoops in order to get to that conclusion. The worst offender of this is Ghostrunner, whose story is a different kind of getting lost than the rest of the entries on this list. This being a point-and-click adventure game with admittedly muddy graphics means that seeing what you're supposed to click on next can be rather annoying. There's also the usual point-and-click trapping of the next step of the journey often being rather unclear to the player. But also, even when you do manage to find your way around, if you know what you're getting into with this game, then you know that one wrong dialogue choice can cost you the best ending. If you're too stubborn to look up a guide, well, have fun with constantly hesitating and second-guessing literally every choice that you can make in this story. Number 3. World 8-4, Super Mario Bros. If you have trouble with memorization or pattern recognition, especially when dealing with repetitive environments, then allow me to be the first to welcome you to your new personal hell. Super Mario Bros. World 8-4. 8-4. World 8-4 is an infamous level amongst NAEA's veterans, as unlike previous levels, it's one giant puzzle rather than a linear dash to the goal. The trick is finding the right warp pipe to go into to find the exit. A lot of you have already probably figured out the issue here, but for those slower on the uptake, all of the pipes look the bloody same. You have to keep careful track of which pipe goes where, because if you forget even one, you run the risk of either missing the right pipe or going down the wrong pipe multiple times. While sharing the one mercy with Metroid of this being on the NAEAs and thus not being able to be as nearly as complex as later iterations of this type of level puzzle, World 8-4 is still teeth-grindingly frustrating. Number 2, Death Mountain, Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link. Most would turn to the Water Temple for a list like this, but at least the Water Temple mostly leaves you alone while rendering you hopelessly lost. The same courtesy cannot be extended to Death Mountain in Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link. Zelda 2, unlike the other Zelda games, is an RPG first and foremost, with experience gained through combat, so there is a wisdom to having one of the dungeons be a marathon of combat encounters for XP, but the problem is that Death Mountain comes way too early in the game for a dungeon this long and this hard, and also it's a confusing winding maze of absolute pain. You will constantly be wondering where to go next, and even when you aren't lost, you'll be hounded by the toughest enemies of the first half of the game at every turn. When you leave Death Mountain, you are truly ready to take on the rest of the game, because it just cannot be harder than that, right? And then it turns out that the other dungeons are even tougher, but at least you'll know where you're going in those, so a small blessing, I guess. And number 1, The Blood Trail, Max Payne. The Blood Trail, from a story and character perspective, is a unique and brutal look into the hole that is Max's soul, where his family used to be in the original Max Payne game. How it has swallowed him, leaving him lost in a maze of his own guilt, forever following a blood trail across a world drowned in black, knowing that he will not like what awaits for him at the end, is pretty brutal to experience. But from a gameplay standpoint, this level is infuriating. Yes, the themes at play are hauntingly beautiful, but the maze is so confusing that you will get what the game is trying to tell you and then be stuck there for approximately 10 minutes more, trying dead-end corridor after dead-end corridor until you lose your bloody mind. The only clue you have as to which way to go is the sound of screaming off in the distance, and if this game was made on more advanced audio software, then that would actually help, but as it stands, the echo isn't nearly effective enough to lead you in the right direction, often just being a bait for yet more dead ends. The Blood Trail is the most infuriating example on this list. It's easy to appreciate what it's trying to do, but in practice, all of those juicy metaphors get buried underneath frustrating gameplay.
It takes a lot for a modern game developer with a sizable budget to release something with notably challenging or difficult elements. Just look at the divisive reception to Returnal, for example, but at the same time, gaming's roots in the arcade mean the challenging subject matter will always come back around. I'm Scott from WhatCulture.com, and these are 9 divisive video game levels you either love or hate. Number 9, any platforming level, Doom Eternal. Talk about splitting a fandom down the middle. After the immaculate revival of Doom from 2016, all eyes were on id Software and charismatic creative director Hugo Martin to see where the franchise would go from here. Would it be another serviceable sequel that simply gives us more of what they knew we wanted? More Mick Gordon riffs, more gore, more tightly designed levels that combined old school power-ups with the pace of modern shooters? Or would they dare to try something else? Not rest on their laurels and go for broke, with the greater risk of failure if they couldn't maintain that momentum. Thankfully, in an artistic sense, it opted for the latter. While personally I think the platforming sections of Eternal work as a reprieve from the sheer intensity of everything else, these gauntlets of wall climbs, fireball dodges, and air dashes were enough to put some people off hitting credits at all. Number 8, Niflheim, God of War 2018. Arguably the one portion of the otherwise immaculate God of War from 2018 that didn't land with 100% confidence, Niflheim saw Sony Santa Monica essentially put a miniature Dark Souls tribute in the middle of their game. Thankfully for the detractors, it was optional, but for those who wanted the best gear in the game, they'd have to wade into some poisonous mist constantly sapping Kratos' health, withstand enemies attacking from all directions, suffer poor visibility, and a maze-like design for the level itself. On the pro side, this was ostensibly a way to give hardcore players an optional endgame loot grind if they still wanted to fight post-credits. Taken alongside Muspelheim's trials and the hunt for every last Valkyr, including the Queen, God of War's upper echelons of difficulty were either appreciated or it tarnished the package overall. Number 7, The Mountains, Death Stranding. Death Stranding's completion percentage of just 28.5% highlights a game that truly isn't for everyone, but often the best pieces of art aren't. Hideo Kojima is certainly a divisive figure in himself, and for his first post-Konami venture, we got a hiking simulator where most of your time is spent just trying to stand up, with the remainder going towards fighting often invisible demons who can reset your progress if you don't have enough blood and poop grenades saved up to retaliate. The mountainous area that comes towards the end of the second third of the game though, that's when Kojima really turns up the awkward and arduous side of things, truly asking if you're going to stick out this journey till the end or not. Balancing stacks of items on character Sam's back is one thing, but now you're trudging through thick snow. Your baby companion routinely cries from the weather and your back and forth momentum, and the base layout of this area involves trekking super slowly up and down some very steep inclines. Throw in random attacks from invisible enemies, and this is the single most identifiable point where you'll either fall in love with Death Stranding's struggle or give up altogether. Number 6. Freefall. Grand Theft Auto San Andreas. GTA San Andreas is divisive in itself once you look back. The game that apexed Rockstar's foray into wackier territory and saw Saints Row change its franchise identity over time, with Rockstar instead embracing seriousness with GTA 4. In San Andreas though, fans have remained notably divided over its crazier anything goes aspects. Things like acquiring a jetpack is either the coolest idea ever, or it just doesn't belong in this rags to riches tale. The same goes for Freefall, a mission where CJ leaps from a biplane into a passenger cruiser, then we play in first person with dedicated buttons for leaning as the rest of the mission plays out like Time Crisis. San Andreas was every bit Rockstar throwing everything at the wall and stapling it there to stick. You either love that approach and this third 3D installment is a favourite, or it's where the dev team stretched things so far that they snapped. Number 5. Pushing Inland. The Last of Us Part 2. Not a divisive level because of anything gameplay related, but for those who couldn't get on board with The Last of Us 2's lengthier campaign, fading back up after Ellie decides to pursue Abby yet again after Ellie and Dina have a completely stable family life and a farm was a step too far. Thematically, Naughty Dog are going for the notion of violence in this world repeating no matter what. We see new gang the Rattlers take over Santa Barbara just like the Washington Liberation Front or the Seraphites have done before, or the likes of Joel and Tommy's gang before that. In-game though, it can feel notably protracted, despite that feeling being intentional. If you already weren't enjoying or appreciating this belabored tone, Pushing Inland can feel like an utter slog. Number 4. Driving. L.A. Noire. L.A. Noire often feels like Rockstar's forgotten game, and that's largely because their involvement came long into development. After Team Bondi had begun their super expensive motion capture work, head honcho Brendan McNamara was kinda losing his mind, and the project was about to fall apart completely. Rockstar came in and helped the whole thing get over the finish line, but not before rockstarring it up a bit. Interstitial driving segments were fleshed out, as was the game's combat model, and in came a handful of side missions to do as a corner minimap was the finishing touch. Now, either you love how much this fleshes out the setting of 1940s Los Angeles, or it fundamentally segments L.A. Noire into a game of two halves. One half an ambitious detective sim with stellar facial animation, and the other a somewhat half-baked open-world game from the early 2000s with very little to do other than head to the next main mission. Number 3. Untouchable. Hitman 3. Taken alongside its add-on packs for Hitman 2016 and Hitman 2, the final platform for content that is Hitman 3 represents the most impressive feat of coding and gameplay in IO Interactive's history. That said, Hitman 3's final level is a huge departure from the franchise, and more in line with their upcoming work on James Bond. Channeling the immaculate final level from Blood Money where Agent 47 rises from the dead after faking a flatline, you come to in a train owned by Illuminati-style group Providence. What follows feels like Hitman by way of Uncharted 2, with Agent 47 moving in and out of windows, going carriage by carriage in a completely linear fashion until you get to kill target Arthur Edwards. In a rare beat for the entire new Hitman trilogy, this just doesn't feel like a level you'd want to replay over and over. There are very few ways to deviate from the straightforward path ahead, and it resulted in a notably divided fandom, either praising this risky change of pace or being disappointed by it. Number 2. Shipment. Call of Duty Modern Warfare. Either Call of Duty Shipment level is the tightest, most instantly furious version of Call of Duty possible, and that's exactly what you come to this Twitch reaction shooter for in the first place, or it's a map where your lifespan being a few seconds makes the whole thing unplayable. Honestly, I'm firmly in the former camp, as especially when Infinity Ward revamped COD's gunplay in 2019, creating the best feeling Call of Duty ever, it must be said, Shipment took on a whole new level of intensity. Obviously though, the flip side is totally valid. This is a tiny boxed off set of shipping containers with right angles galore and sightlines begging for spawn camping. Still, there's something about Shipment that forces you to be in the zone or get the F out more than any other level, and that's always worth talking about. And number 1, the Mako. Mass Effect. I have always loved the big stupid floaty Mako. A vehicle from the original Mass Effect that was brought literally down to Earth in Mass Effect Andromeda. The original and Legendary Editions version 2 are floaty as hell and make no sense contextually, as they'd kill anyone sat inside. And yet there's a wealth of Mass Effect fans that love bounding around in this thing. The first game in the trilogy frames multiple main missions around it, not to mention the wealth of side content where you can touch down on everywhere from far off ice planets to our own moon. Honestly, a large part of the first game's appeal was becoming an intergalactic space marine with your own ship, then choosing to fire the Mako up mountainsides and off cliffs as much as you could. All that is, unless of course you hate the way this vehicle feels to the core, which is a super common opinion from the last decade and a half. Let me know down in the comments if you've reapproached these levels using the Mass Effect Legendary Edition, or where you've sat on the Mako since 2007.
Having a really good explorer into your favorite games can be an excellent idea, as you never quite know what hidden goodies are stashed away in the most unexpected of areas. Secret levels, for one, are usually something special, occasionally offering an odd twist to everything. Sure, taking the fight to a railway station is one thing, but what about a gunfight inside a fun slide made up of flesh, bone, and rivers of blood rushing at top speed? That's another. After checking out our top 10 most surreal secret levels in video games, share any honorable mentions in the comments below. The weirder, the better. I'm Jess from What Culture, and here are 8 twisted secret levels in video games. Number 8. Ziggurat Vertigo. Quake. Quake may not have had the same personality as its predecessor Doom or its rival at the time Duke Nukem 3D, but it is one of the finest shooters of all time. The game's first chapter hosts a very unique secret level, especially when compared to the others. When you spawn inside, you realize Ziggurat Vertigo is a tall level with a temple nearby. And as you go for a jump, you'll find that, oh, hold on, wait a minute, the gravity is not what you'd expect it to be. The hint's in the name. The level has 1/8 gravity, meaning a simple jump can send you quite literally flying. You'll fall like a feather, preferably not into a pool of lava. It adds a tricky twist to the situation. You can make extravagant leaps of faith to reach higher parts of the level, and can leap over obstacles while pumping out a few dozen nails or carpet bombing the ogres. On the flip side, you'll be a sitting duck to the flying monsters, as well as the big bad lightning blasting shamblers up top. You can't fall any faster, so deciding where and when to jump is crucial. Zero gravity gunfights in Ziggurat Vertigo are a one-of-a-kind experience. Prepare to die a lot, and most of your deaths will probably be marked by you slowly and delicately falling into a pool of lava. Number 7. Nightmare. Wolfenstein: The New Order. Waiting for a Wolfenstein game that was actually good was a little bit like waiting for World War II to end. Machine Games finally delivered the goods in the form of a dystopian cyber-Nazi bloodbath. Using those dual assault rifles never gets old. Partway through the game, our super buff hero William Blazkowicz hoped to finally get a good night's sleep. Conversely, his subconscious is burdened with the same dream, escaping from a labyrinth with resistance around every corner. Welcome back to 1992, everyone. This level is entitled Nightmare, and it pits your 3-dimensional protagonist against 16-bit Germans. The objective is simple: escape. Every item, level, prop, and secret from Wolfenstein 3D remain intact. It's spacious and full of corridors, making it a playground for balls-out gunfights combined with stylish sliding and shooting across the castle's floors. In fact, those who remember the location of the switch to the secret level will be pleased to know that it is also available here. It's a 2-for-1 deal, a bargain in any player's book. One death means you're out for the count. You can always restart that portion of the level and do it again. That said, it's well worth it for the flashback of Nazis in bright blue jumpsuits who scream "Mein Leben" every time they die. Number 6. Club Doom. Doom, PlayStation. Many gamers fondly remember the secret Wolfenstein 3D throwback missions in Doom 2 Hell on Earth. Exploring the deep, confusing layout of the nefarious labyrinth castle Wolfenstein was a nice treat. Because of the popularity of Doom and its sequel, companies were all emptying their wallets in order to get permission to port the game to their consoles. Most of them were second-rate to the PC version. The PlayStation port, however, was unique. For one, there were console-exclusive levels that were well designed and really fun to play. Instead of another copy and pasted labyrinth full of the Jerrys, there were more than a few secret levels in this one. A chunk of them were exclusives. Club Doom is the hardest to find since it's hidden within a secret level. Outside of the club is the developer's logo. Distorted groans of babies echo around the void as you walk up to the door and sprint above the stairs. The music abruptly stops and is replaced with a frantic techno beat. There is indeed a disco dance floor, and the cages surrounding it are infested with revenant strippers. A bar nearby will offer health potions, while nearby weaponry will help clear off the multicolored dance floor. Short, sweet, and utterly silly, Club Doom is most certainly the oddest level in the entire series. Show them who the true Rocket Man is by dueling the demons with a one-man Disco Inferno dance-off. Number 5. Giant Ants. Command & Conquer Red Alert Counter-Strike. Now, Red Alert wasn't supposed to be its own standalone game, it was just supposed to be an add-on for the first game in the series, but it ended up becoming its own entity. In this universe, it's allies versus Soviets, versatility and crafty technology against pure brute strength and unconventional warfare. The first add-on, Counter-Strike, introduced a balmy set of secret levels to the mix. To access them, you had to hold shift and click the speaker. How people were supposed to figure this out is anyone's guess. To greet the player, cheesy music plays and a giant ant appears alongside a logo that says, "It came from Red Alert." This mini-campaign pits the boys and girls of the UK against a horde of giant mutated ants. They can shoot through steel like it was made of pastry, and some of them spew fireballs. After a scouting mission, you must repair your damaged base and fend off the ugly insects. Then there's the matter of poisoning their nests with the help of some eggheads in order to prevent them from swarming the whole map. The grand finale takes place in an underground bunker where our heroes lead a merry chase to the Queen's hive and blow it to pieces. Battling the sugar-stealing horde is not easy by any means, but it sure is satisfying. Number 4. The Moo Moo Farm. Diablo II. Rumors were buzzing back when Diablo I was buzzing about that there was a secret level full of cows. As you'd imagine, it was a load of tripe. The story goes that if you clicked on a certain cow in the game multiple times, you'd be teleported to this fantastic place. Yeah, right. Remember though, this was the 90s, where a rumor could easily become a future feature in the next game. Just look at Mortal Kombat. Getting back on topic, Blizzard decided to add the fabled cow level into Diablo's sequel. Since crafting became an integral part of the game, players tried experimenting with what they had. Some were lucky enough to create a key to enter this bizarre zone. And as you'd expect and hope, it is indeed full of cows. Armed with sharp axes and traveling in large packs, wandering around the area is not a very wise idea unless you want to be turned into burgers. You only get one chance to overthrow their leader, the Cow King, per difficulty level. After that, it's locked up for good. On the plus side, you can snag some wonderful treasures and an excellent story to tell your friends at the local tavern. Number 3. Panzerknacker Unleashed. Medal of Honor Underground. It's safe to say that Medal of Honor was ahead of its time. For example, enemies could kick or knock back your grenades, or decide to sacrifice themselves by jumping on top of one. Instead of charging ahead and opening fire, they drop down on the floor or rush for cover. Another revolutionary feature was the inclusion of killer 6-foot nutcrackers in the sequel. While the game primarily focuses on the badass French resistance member Manon Baptiste, who could blow up tanks with merely a few petrol bombs and an MP40, you play as Jimmy Patterson from the first game, who must investigate a German castle containing a scientist's experiments gone awry. And that's the nice way of putting it. Among other oddities, you'll fight dogs firing rocket launchers on their hind legs, green zombies with exploding heads, knights ready to pounce at you, and 6-foot nutcracker robots with anti-tank weapons. The objective is to steal the paperwork and find the pieces for your very own Panzerknacker. After assembly, it's time for a merry rush through the swarms of nutcrackers with your new buddy. Team up, let it take the damage, or abandon it. Either way, it's none too easy, so a helping hand in the game with a few allies is always welcome. For a series that specialized in simulating realistic battles, this was definitely the nuttiest thing to come out of the game. Number 2. House of Horrors. Blood. Blood was like Duke Nukem 3D, with its sprite-based engine, buckets of gore, expansive map, and cheesy one-liners. However, this game was horror-themed, featuring fewer aliens and more monsters, cultists, and dark humor. Oh, and even more delicious giblets. Hidden in a cabal-infested carnival complete with deadly tightrope acts, rat burgers, mimes, and zombie head football, a secret level will take the player to a happy family-friendly super speedy slide under construction. Open the mouth-shaped funhouse to make your way to the slide, where you'll find the sides are made of flesh and will bleed when shot. Yikes! Manic laughter is heard as you jump into the blood falls and ascend at top speed through this frightening wild ride. Aside from passing through mutilated corpses of some helpless victims, there are cultists and zombies that await behind props and in cages surrounding the stomach-shaped plunge pool where you get off. It may be linear, but resistance is very heavy. The shotgun-wielding loonies can even jump into the faux stomach acid pool and gun you down in the water. This is one secret level that will scare the living daylights out of you with its jump scares and enemies around every corner. Not to mention the call for security at the zombie cage, which unleashes a squad of brain chompers your way. Number 1. The Grand Vomitorium / Escape from the Vomitorium. Rise of the Triad. Now, there was a few warp-only levels that existed in this cult classic shooter, one of which was the Grand Vomitorium. Sounds charming. It was so unfair, level designer Joe Siegler wanted you to get as annoyed by it as possible, even going as far as to encourage you to cheat in order to win. Everything seems as usual to begin with, hopping rides on floating pads in huge rooms with "You do not belong here" scrolled across each wall. Then you're dropped into what looks like a floor with sky and no walls. Fall off the map and you're dead. You have to go through a few tight corridors with an elasto mode to turn you into rubber and send you flying into the void to reach a lift, which teleports you to another void-filled room. In the distance, "Cheat now" is spelled out with floating hover pads. You have limited time to dodge the incoming pads. They're ready to push you off the edge too. Squeeze through another tight strip of floor and beat the level. Naturally, it's much easier said than done. It's mind-blowing though. Siegler was utilizing every exploit in the engine to tease the player. Rot's reboot featured Escape from the Vomitorium with death-defying feats of pants-shitting platforming after being launched hundreds of feet into the air. The hallucinogenic and bouncy power downs are all in play, ready to fling you into the void. And to reward your valiant vomit-inducing actions, a dope fish will fly out and eat you, thus ending the stage. Twisted stuff.
Now, there's nothing quite like playing a video game that's not just good or even great, but basically flat out perfect. Knowing that you're playing the work of masters at the top of their game is exhilarating, because sustaining such a high level of quality across potentially dozens of hours of gameplay, well, that is an insanely hard task. But then that level arrives. Now, perfection is a tall order to strive for, and so it's little surprise that so many games get so incredibly close to the mark, only for one section of gameplay to let the whole thing down. Now, in the case of these 10 games, all of which received rave reviews from critics and are ranked amongst some of the greatest entries into their respective franchises, well, they offered up just a single level that just put a slight dampener on the entire experience. So let's take a look at them. As I'm Jules, this is WhatCulture.com, and these are 10 levels that stopped video games from being perfect. Number 10, Ironwood, God of War Ragnarok. God of War Ragnarok is an absolutely mesmerizing masterpiece of a AAA blockbuster, but there is one section in the game that just split fans right down the middle, and that is Ironwood. Roughly 1/3 of the way through the story, players are once again given control of Atreus, for what they surely assume will be another brief detour from the main campaign. But his journey through Ironwood drags on for about 2 hours of stamina-sapping fetch quests, repetitive combat, and dull walking around. I know that Ironwood definitely is beautiful and arguably the best looking area in the entire game, but the content therein feels like the most blatant sort of AAA padding, especially with the MMO tier quality for the unimaginative objectives. Now, Ironwood is useful for Atreus' character development, but did they really need to make it so bloody long? In a game otherwise defined by excellent pacing, this sluggish section is a tedious slog that feels like optional content that was accidentally made mandatory, and proves especially egregious on repeat playthroughs. Number 9, Titanic Monarch Zone, Sonic Mania. Now, Sonic Mania was a stunning reminder of just how great the franchise can be when due care was put into developing it. It's a fine example of a shamelessly nostalgic game that nevertheless largely earns its nostalgia, seemingly outlining a promising future direction for the series, but one that sadly hasn't ever been followed up on. As incredible as Sonic Mania is though, there is one zone that just pisses off just about anybody and unfortunately tarnishes what's otherwise the best Sonic game in literally decades. Of course, we're talking about the Titanic Monarch zone, the final zone of the main game and one of the zones created specifically for Sonic Mania rather than being a remix of a classic one. For starters, Titanic Monarch zone is considerably longer than any other zone in the game, ensuring that many players will find themselves succumbing to the 10-minute time limit per act. Beyond that, the enemy and obstacle placement feel insanely cheap, not to mention the presence of the ruby mist which will randomly teleport you around the map during Act 2. Given the likelihood that you'll end up with at least one game over during the final boss fight and have to start the entire zone from the beginning all over again, it can end up feeling more like a time sink than an actual good time. If you rage quit Sonic Mania during this level, well, nobody can actually blame you. Number 8. Obliteration Imminent. Dead Space. With the recent release of the fantastic Dead Space remake, what better time to reconsider the classic original and its single festering blemish of a mission? The game's 4th chapter, Obliteration Imminent, climaxes with the player taking control of a cannon to shoot incoming asteroids down to prevent the USG Ishimura's destruction. And as much as that might sound like a fun break from the necromorph stomping gameplay, it is not at all. Though a successful run through this section only takes 2 minutes in theory, it's incredibly difficult to hit all the incoming asteroids without overheating the cannons, ensuring that you're damn near guaranteed to fail this thing a bunch of times. It's especially challenging to survive on consoles because it doesn't have the precision of a mouse, enough so that some players ultimately resorted to cranking their display's brightness up to get a better look at the projectiles. Given this mission's infamy, many wondered how EA would treat it in the remake, and what a pleasant surprise it was to see it completely reworked with a similarly themed but quite different variation that wasn't nearly as punishing. Thank God. Number 7. The PAL card backtracking. Metal Gear Solid. Hideo Kojima's original Metal Gear Solid is one of the most innovative and ambitious video games, and say it with me kids, of all time! An endlessly creative, gorgeously cinematic stealth actioner that is still a blast to play in its original form some 25 years later. But for all of its many wondrous moments and incredible boss battles, there is one section which continues to haunt players all of these years on, and that is the permissive action link or PAL card nonsense near the end of the game. The PAL card changes its shape depending on the temperature that it's subjected to, and in order to try and use it to stop Liquid Snake from launching Metal Gear Rex, you'll need to take it to a cold environment, return it to the computer, take it to a hot environment, and then take it back to the computer once more. This forces the player to listlessly backtrack to both the frosty warehouse where they previously fought Vulcan Raven, and then the blast furnace, and if players don't return to the computer quickly enough each time, the alloy will lose its shape, forcing them to try again. It is pure, aggravating busy work, and while only a small portion of the game overall, it is by far the laziest and least interesting part of Metal Gear Solid. Mercifully, Kojima took the vocal fan outcry on board for his 2004 remake Metal Gear Solid The Twin Snakes, which made it far more convenient for players to change the card's shape with nearby objects. Number 6. Demolition Man. Grand Theft Auto Vice City. Let's face it, every Grand Theft Auto game has that level that just pisses everybody off with its absurdly punishing level of difficulty. In the case of GTA Vice City, it is surely Demolition Man, where you're tasked with piloting a remote control helicopter in order to plant 4 bombs around a construction site within a 7-minute time limit. Now that might sound generous enough, but between the maddening controls and resistance that you'll face from goons in the area, this is a mission which many players spend hours just trying to get through. Now granted, you can do yourself a huge favor by taking out as many goons as possible first, especially as the timer doesn't start until you pick up the first bomb, but it's still an absolutely hellish mission due to the infuriating clunkiness of piloting this damn thing. As woefully disappointing as it was, at least the recent Definitive Edition remaster of Vice City both added 30 seconds onto the mission timer and allowed players to instantly restart the mission upon failing, rather than having to go back to the mission marker from scratch. Number 5. The Meat Circus. Psychonauts. Now, Psychonauts is a game of such mesmerizing creativity. It is a solid gold cult classic which desperately deserves to be championed by many more people, but that is except for its final mental world, which is, of course, the infamous meat circus. Now, in theory, there are some really neat and twisted ideas at play here, given that the level's poultry-tastic circus aesthetics are the result of protagonist Rasputin and Coach Oleander's respective childhood memories of the circus and a butcher shop colliding in totally insane fashion. But this painful slog of a level is a life-force-draining chore comprised of an escort mission, finicky platforming that is also timed, regenerating enemies, and a pain in the ass of a boss fight to boot. It doesn't help that the controls and camera feel totally non-conductive to this being a fun level in any way as well. The latest Steam release of Psychonauts did thankfully see developer Double Fine listen to vocal complaints enough to give the level a notable nerf. But for those of us who took it on in its original form, it ensured an otherwise amazing game, well, sputtered to an exasperating finish. Number 4. The escape sequences, Ori and the Blind Forest. Ori and the Blind Forest and its sequel, Ori and the Will of the Wisps, are some of the most beautiful and mechanically precise adventure games from the last decade. It's clear that so much effort has been put into every aspect of their creation, so it's rather a shame that those pesky escape sequences are such damn downers. Both games feature a number of delineated sequences in which the player must maneuver Ori away from the incoming danger, such as a rising tide of water or massive enemy giving chase. Which sounds great, right? Well, except these sequences have no checkpoints to speak of, and lasting as long as 2 minutes apiece, force the player into a rote exercise of trial and error memorization. Some of the more punishing escape sequences are absolutely maddening and can take even above average skilled players dozens of attempts to get through. If these segments at least had a checkpoint placed into the middle, well, they wouldn't be so annoying, but as it stands, they deliver ridiculous difficulty spikes and, worse still, massive time sinks in an otherwise sublime work of art. Number 3. Isla del Sol, Bayonetta. Bayonetta is one of the most beloved character action games ever, widely lauded for its flamboyant style and of course its inimitable protagonist, but things take a turn for the absolute BS in one of the game's final chapters, Isla del Sol, which initially ditches the typical combat gameplay in favor of a rail shooter inspired by the classic 1985 arcade game Space Harrier. The prospect of riding a missile while taking down bad guys sounds fun in theory, but lasting for an entire 10 minutes, as it does without a single damn checkpoint to speak of, means that failure is going back to the very beginning and repeating the whole thing again. Naturally, this can be supremely irritating if you die more than a couple of times, which, given the degree of challenge on even lower difficulties, you are definitely likely to, which adds up to a terribly balanced level that just asks way too much of most players. The boss fight against Jean in the second half of the level is an absolute blast, but getting there, well, that is a major chore. And number 1, Monster, Wolfenstein 2, The New Colossus. Wolfenstein 2 The New Colossus is one hell of a beefy, brutal FPS, a gorgeous, savage title that's certainly no picnic even on lower difficulties, but an adrenaline-infused blast all the same. But Machine Games tipped the balance a little too far in the game's 5th chapter, Monster, which climaxes with a 5-minute shooting gallery set in a courthouse. Now look, shooting Nazis in the face won't probably ever get boring, but this level really does put that notion to the test, given that you're tasked with surviving an exhausting horde of endlessly respawning, heavily armored Nazis while lacking much in the way of resources yourself. It is a textbook example of a piss-taking difficulty spike that simply wasn't paid sufficient enough attention during the game's QA process, and the fact that it's subsequently revealed to be a dream sequence only makes its punishing level of challenge that much more obnoxious. On the plus side though, if you can make it through this chapter, well, you're basically golden for the rest of the game, but still, no thanks.
The perfect video game, of course, doesn't exist, and even if a game is able to achieve consistent greatness, that of course isn't enough for everybody, being that video games are subjective, even in a year as jam-packed with releases as 2023. Yet sometimes it's agonizingly obvious that part of the game just isn't working and should have been cut entirely in the development phase. Yeah, for whatever reason, it made it to the final release. These levels all bring their respective games down a peg, ranging from tedious, soul-destroying minigames to unfairly difficult bosses, unbearably tedious, unskippable tutorials, and everything in between. If these levels were given the chop, there's not a single soul who would have complained. And in some of these cases, it probably would have meant that developers would have saved players a bunch of money on broken controllers. I'm Jess from What Culture, and here are 10 levels that should have been cut from recent video games. Number 10, the Power Collection minigame, Starfield. Starfield is one of 2023's most disappointing games for many reasons, but right at the top of the list, the head-smackingly dull, repetitive manner in which you unlock powers throughout the sci-fi epic. During the main story, you'll be periodically directed to anomalies contained within temples, and here you can acquire unique abilities that enhance both your offensive and defensive capabilities. Except, the means for unlocking them is the same, every freaking time. You enter the temple, find the anomaly, and then participate in a resoundingly lame minigame where you fly around a room making contact with dust clouds ad nauseum until the game finally decides you've done it enough to receive a power. If many surely assumed that each power would have its own bespoke minigame, the fact that it's the exact same nonsense every single time really underlines how egregiously Bethesda cut corners when they were developing Starfield. Speaking of cut, if they just wanted to get rid of the minigame entirely and just give us the powers once we found the anomaly, that would have been great. Number 9. Most of the prologue, Forspoken. Man, what a letdown Forspoken was. A thunderously generic open-world action game with not a single original strand of DNA in its body. That said, the game didn't even give itself a chance to hook players given how much of a leaden slog its overlong prologue is. It's several hours before the world of Athia opens up to the player, before which they're forced to sit through reams of tedious exposition-heavy cutscenes and a funnel down a linear gameplay corridor as they learn the basics. Onboarding is such an important part of any AAA game, and in this case, Square Enix desperately needed to streamline the process. Giving players the keys to Athia really needed to be more of a focal point than it was, because by the time that actually happens, there's a good chance a lot of players have mentally checked out. In a year where so many incredible games were released and players had so many other options, taking 2 hours to remove the shackles and let players go off was a colossal, possibly flop-inducing mistake. Number 8. All the open combat missions. Call of Duty Modern Warfare 3. Call of Duty Modern Warfare 3's campaign was a massive flop for many reasons, not the least of which was that half the game was comprised of open combat missions. Open world missions where players can choose to complete objectives either through stealth or Rambo tactics. It is not an inherently terrible idea, yet the levels are so joyless and uncreative. It had most players just hoping for the typical linear bread and butter stuff that Call of Duty does so well. It's painfully obvious that Activision just copy-pasted the Warzone gameplay template in order to pad the campaign out and get the game to market in a hurry. And the result is the most creatively bankrupt and low effort of all the Call of Duty story modes to date. Even if you cut out all those open combat missions, the campaign would still feel like a really underbaked affair, and an incredibly short one at that. If you're playing Modern Warfare 3 for anything but the multiplayer, you're gonna have a bad time. Number 7. The Hostess minigame. Like a Dragon, Gaiden, the man who erased his name. Many of the Yakuza and Like a Dragon games have included vaguely risque minigames involving hostess clubs, but the recent The Man Who Erased His Name dialed this up to the most cringe-worthy zenith yet. In a mandatory mission in the game, you're tasked with checking out Club Heavenly. Once inside the cabaret club, you're forced to choose between one of two hostesses, triggering a first-person live-action minigame where you're required to small talk, drink, and give a gift to your hostess of choice. Now, this meeting is far from sexually explicit, but the goofy awkwardness of playing a glorified live-action dating sim and being unable to progress the story unless you do makes this brief mission absolutely excruciating. Making this an unskippable part of the game was really just such a choice, Sega. Number 6. Egg Fortress Act 2 Sonic Superstars. Sonic Superstars was a fitfully enjoyable entry into the franchise, largely undone by its battery of infuriating boss battles, which through their maddening length, difficulty, and lack of checkpointing, turned the overall experience into a fatiguing dirge. And this finally reaches an unbearable fever pitch in the game's final level, Egg Fortress Act 2, where it all comes to a head and you'll be reduced to a tearful, gibbering wreck. The final battle with Eggman is, appropriately enough, the hardest encounter in the main game, and hellish enough that nobody could be blamed for just putting the controller down and never returning. To put it plainly, this boss fight is bullshit. It's a 10-minute endurance trial where even one error from the player will throw you into a game over screen, and you gotta start the whole thing again. As such, those 10 minutes can easily take hours to get through successfully. Players need to avoid Eggman's projectiles while also dealing with tricky platforming and zero-gravity segments. For a game allegedly aimed at children, it's unreasonably difficult and ends an already disappointing Sonic title on a really annoying note. Number 5. Chapter 15, Resident Evil 4 Remake. Resident Evil 4 Remake is mostly an absolutely terrific game, except for the penultimate chapter, Chapter 15. Now, the island section was by far the most maligned part of the original game, and while it's not quite as tiresome here, it's still the obvious low point of the whole experience. The sheer number of Ganado mercs the game throws at you, the turrets, and basically everything about teaming up with Mike and the helicopter, it's like being served a delicious meal that just doesn't know when to stop, and so by the game's end, you feel sick and need to lie down. And if you're enough of a masochist to want to play it on professional difficulty, well, you're gonna have a really, really bad time. Or a good time, if you like pain and hard games. Much as this is nevertheless the climax of the game, it could have done with some serious trimming in the remake, because it feels intended solely to wear the player down and erode their will to keep playing. Number 4, the beam puzzles. Deliver Us Mars. Deliver Us Mars was certainly an ambitious sequel to the sci-fi adventure Deliver Us the Moon, and you know the part that everybody hated? Those damn beam puzzles. Though the sequel thankfully ditches the maddening stealth sections of its predecessor, these are effectively replaced with mind-numbingly tedious puzzles in which you need to align a series of laser beams in order to open locked doors. These puzzles recur with a frustrating regularity throughout the game's campaign and grow untenably fiddly and complex by the game's end. Enough that you couldn't be blamed for just looking up the solution on YouTube and being done with it. While it's clear that some thought and creativity went into devising the puzzles, they're ultimately more of a pacing annihilating drag than something that's actually satisfying and rewarding. The game really would have been better if they just took them out entirely, because you're gonna groan every single time you see one. Number 3, the tutorial, Forza Motorsport. Yet another huge letdown release this year, the new Forza Motorsport lacked the meticulously crafted magic of its predecessor, as was depressingly abundant from its open tutorial section. For reasons that will only be clear to Turn 10 Studios, the racing sim for some reason forces all players to sit through a 2-hour tutorial that lays down all the basics. Even if you're a veteran player and you know exactly what you're doing, you're in for a boring time. Sure, the game absolutely should include a tutorial for the uninitiated, but why the hell wouldn't it be skippable for veterans of the franchise who just want to dig into the meat of the game? As such, Forza Motorsport immediately got off on the wrong foot, with many who didn't feel like being babysat through a tutorial section so personality devoid it probably turned off some of those trying the series for the first time. The game's career mode as a whole is pretty darn disappointing, but I mean, at least the tutorial's so bad you knew that from the beginning. Number 2, Mary Jane's Stealth Missions, Spider-Man 2. Insomniac's first Spider-Man game was rightly dinged for the handful of stealth-based missions where players control Miles Morales and especially Mary Jane Watson. Between the generic stealth mechanics and the instant fail states if you managed to get caught, these turned out to be agonizing sections every single time you ran into one. And so it was assumed that they almost certainly wouldn't be returning for Spider-Man 2, and yet the MJ stealth sections are indeed back, even if this time she's given a stun gun to make the perp-evading experience a little less loathsome. Yes, it'd be dramatic to say the stealth missions are quite so oppressive this time around, but they're still a part of the game that just about nobody was asking to be included. Why not just keep it a web-swinging Spider-Man game, or just make these missions optional? It's wildly unnecessary, and considering how long MJ's few missions last, quite boring. Insomniac, just know you really don't need to include these in the inevitable third game. Number 1, Ancient Cheese, Pizza Tower. Pizza Tower was easily one of 2023's most pleasantly surprising games. A delirious and delicious platformer throwback that's one of the most creative and unexpected entries into the genre in quite some time. Pretty much the whole game is a sweaty palmed blast. However, there is one infamous level that players in general seem to have not enjoyed so much, to put it really, really lightly, and that's Ancient Cheese. If someone involved with the game revealed that this level was the original prototype which they included in the the final game as a gag, it'd be easy to believe. It's not awful by any means, it just feels noticeably straightforward, even boring compared to every other level, and the bomb mechanic isn't fun. In a game packed with so many creative levels, the one average one really does stick out like a sore thumb, and probably should have been cut entirely. We love you, Pizza Tower, but this level just ain't it.
Video game developers have treated players to a delightful smorgasbord of exciting and memorable levels over the years. The best of these kind of levels come into existence when developers go all out with their creativity to come up with some of the most unique concepts around. The more bizarre, the better. I'm Cy for WhatCulture.com, and here are the 10 weirdest video game levels we can't stop thinking about. Number 10, A Pleasant Day, Saints Row 4. In a series where spraying pedestrians with sewage and committing insurance fraud is just a normal part of daily life for the leader of the 3rd Street Saints, the Saints Row games are littered with some of the craziest things that players can do. But it's the 4th entry where gamers were treated to the franchise's weirdest mission to date, and that's A Pleasant Day. Early into the game, after the Saints leader becomes the President of the United States, an invading alien force arrive on Earth and kidnap the protagonist alongside their companions. It's at this point where the bizarre level begins, opening with the leader waking up in a 1950s flavoured sitcom titled Leave It to the Saints, complete with jaunty music and a laugh track. The mission tasks players with making their way downstairs to eat some pancakes and retrieve the morning paper before venturing outside to meet the folksy locals. Everything's incredibly wholesome to this point. It's the opposite of what players expect from a Saints Row game, and that's why it's so brilliant. Of course, it concludes with a classic Saints Row rampage, and so the level stands out as being one of the most creatively silly moments from the series' most outlandish entry. Number 9, The Silver Shroud, Fallout 4. Between swarms of mutated wildlife, dangerous raider gangs, and deadly amounts of radiation, the post-apocalyptic world of Fallout 4 is a grim place for its inhabitants to carve out an existence. Scattered amongst the serious plot thread that sees the protagonist's search for their missing child, though, are some oddball quests. The best of this strange bunch is The Silver Shroud, which sees players cosplay as the eponymous crime fighter from a pulpy radio series. This quest begins after hearing a radio message from Silver Shroud enthusiast Kent Connolly in Goodbye Neighbor. He wants to bring his favourite character to life to act as a beacon of hope for the locals and asks players to step into the role. After stealing the hero's signature costume, players will then be tasked with enacting swift justice on some criminals. It's quite straightforward as quests go, however it's the option to deliver dialogue as the 1930s comic book character that turns this one into a campy romp that's simply tons of fun to play. Alongside giving players a slick outfit that they'll likely never take off again, the Silver Shroud gave players one of the most memorably unique quests within the Fallout series. Number 8, Compton's Cook-Off, Psychonauts 2. There's no shortage to wacky and inventive levels from adored cult classic Psychonauts and its sequel. A paranoid milkman, a psychedelic rock concert, and a literal meat circus. There's plenty of examples of weird levels in the series to fill an entire list. One section which stands out from the rest though is Compton's Cook-Off from Psychonauts 2. Upon entering the mind of reclusive Psychonaut founder Compton Bull, plucky protagonist Raz finds himself in a colourful cooking show titled Ram It Down. It's hosted by cartoonish sock puppet versions of Compton's fellow founders who belittle him at every opportunity. The main part of this level sees players participating in the game show by gathering and preparing the required ingredients to complete a selection of increasingly complex dishes within a time limit to impress the cruel judges. Complete with enjoyably terrible puns, silly commercial segments, and a boss fight that involves dodging projectile vomit and feeding puppets until they burst, this section packs the series' infectious charm and boundless creativity into a level that's unlike anything else that Double Fine have ever produced. And on top of that, to make the level even more special, it has a very sincere and thoughtful portrayal of anxiety. Good job, Psychonauts 2 team. Number 7, Sloprano, Conker's Bad Fur Day. Cult favourite Conker's Bad Fur Day is an outrageously weird game for an assortment of reasons. Alongside having a foul-mouthed squirrel as its protagonist, this adventure game from Rare is adored for its fantastically off-the-wall sense of humour that balances the line between raunchy and cartoonish. However, the most outlandish part of this anthropomorphic rodent's hungover journey home is when he ventures into Pooh Mountain during the Sloprano level. Like its name suggests, this area is the epitome of crass toilet humour. In addition to rolling giant balls of excrement, the level also sees players feeding sweet corn to the monster that dwells within the mountain's depths. That creature is the Great Mighty Pooh, the cherry on top of this hilariously gross level. A large pile of feces with a passion for opera singing, fighting this boss involves dodging projectiles that stink worse than this foe's musical talents, while throwing large rolls of toilet paper into his gaping mouth before finishing him off by literally flushing him away. Ending with a superbly terrible pun, this entire sequence feels like playing an incredibly strange fever dream. There's even a catchy song that players can sing along to as well. Number 6, the game, Fable 3. Even without some of the lofty, unfulfilled promises that were made for this title, Fable 3 is nevertheless an incredible RPG brimming with charm and personality. Making up a large chunk of this game's tongue-in-cheek humour are its weird and wonderful side quests, with the game being a notable standout. This quest sees the player tasked by 3 self-described powerful magi to rescue a princess from an evil baron. It's a standard premise for the fantasy genre, however this mission proves to be anything but ordinary once the quest is accepted. After taking the magic orb said to transport players into the baron's realm, the hero shrinks in size and wakes up to find themselves part of the Friends tabletop game. Guided by the bickering trio, players must fight their way through hordes of monsters and demon chickens to reach the baron's castle, while the friends make fourth wall breaking jabs at game design and fantasy tropes. After navigating their way through the miniature world, players will then come face to face with a 2D cutout of the villain who's easily defeated with a single hit. While certainly weird, the real magic of this quest is its irresistible Fable sense of humour and charm. Number 4, The Escape, Inside. Coming from the same developers behind Limbo, Playdead's Inside is just as enthralling and mysterious as the studio's previous game, as it sees an unnamed boy travel across a dystopian landscape and sneak inside a research facility. Between mind control devices, murderous robots and underwater experiments, deciphering this game's cryptic plot is confounding. But hey, at least it looks really nice. However, it's the jaw-dropping final chapter of the game, titled The Escape, that really sticks out in the minds of everyone who's played this remarkable puzzle platformer. Upon venturing deeper into the facility, the protagonist eventually enters a containment tank where they attempt to free a grotesque fleshy blob known as the Huddle. However, the boy is consumed by the massive limbs, at which point the player takes control of it as it makes its grand escape. Breaking through the final wall, the Huddle rolls down the hill before stopping beside the seashore. Unsure if the creature is even still alive and the boy inside it, more importantly, the credits roll and players are left baffled about what they've just seen. Whichever way players choose to make sense of these surreal events, Inside's conclusion remains unfathomably weird. Number 3, A Night to Remember, The Elder Scrolls V Skyrim. Skyrim is an RPG that's bursting with things to discover within every corner of its gigantic map. Between battling dragons and exploring dungeons, the Dragonborn can likewise take part in a selection of strange side quests. Notable examples include talking to a dog, solving a vampiric murder mystery, and entering the mind of a mad emperor. However, the most absurd part of the game comes in the form of the side quest A Night to Remember. Essentially Skyrim's version of The Hangover, this exceptionally silly quest begins when chatting to a stranger called Sam in any of the game's taverns. He'll challenge the hero to a drinking contest, offering the adventurer a staff if they win. After out-drinking Sam, players will then wake up in a temple and be scolded by an enraged priestess for having trashed it the night before. From here, the quest sees players retrace their steps from that evening to discover the madcap, drunken antics they got up to. These include stealing a goat and marrying a hag raven. After finally tracking Sam down, it's revealed that he's been Sanguine, the Daedric princess of debauchery all along, ending this quirky quest on a fittingly strange note. Number 2, Equine Phantoms, The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt. From self-contained tales revolving around difficult choices to chilling monster encounters, The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt contains some of the best quests in gaming history. Despite the plethora of serious quests which deal with moral ambiguity, there are likewise many light-hearted outings that add some levity to the game's otherwise bleak world. One of the most memorable is Equine Phantoms from the Blood and Wine expansion. This quest begins when the player stumbles upon a hermit tormented by a wraith that only they can see. For Geralt to see this spirit for himself, he must drink a special concoction brewed by the hermit. Doing so, however, reveals that the potion has a side effect that enables him to talk to his trusty horse Roach. The pair set out to solve the mystery together in what quickly turns into a hilarious buddy cop outing, full of intriguing twists and excellent horse puns. This game also takes the opportunity to poke fun at itself here with a handful of meta jokes aimed at Roach's ability to seemingly teleport alongside their wonky controls. Place this humorous premise within a genuinely enthralling mystery and Equine Phantoms becomes one of the game's finest and funniest additions. And number 1, we sing Alan Wake 2. Finnish developers Remedy Entertainment are no strangers to experimenting with the fantastically weird in their games. Alan Wake, for example, contained the bombastic stage fight, whereas Control was home to the brain-bending ashtray maze sequence. However, the studio dialed up their love for the bizarre to new heights in Alan Wake 2. Containing a tantalising mix of in-engine cutscenes and live-action footage to weave a twisting survival horror tale, this long-awaited sequel is Remedy at the peak of their creativity. However, nothing in the game is as memorably bonkers as the We Sing level. The 4th chapter in Alan's plotline, this section is a full-blown interactive musical number that explores the eponymous writer's past us through an electrifying rock anthem performed by real-life Finnish band Poets of the Fall. Complete with rapturously campy dance moves, epic guitar riffs, and eye-widening visuals, this level delights throughout its entirety as it takes players on a tour of iconic locations from the previous game, concluding with a toe-tapping jazz number and a celebratory live-action dance routine featuring lead writer Sam Lake and the rest of the cast. This level proves to be the most memorable moment in a game full of them. In fact, everyone fell in love with it so much that there was a campaign to get the dance on stage at the Game Awards 2023, which happened, and it was awesome.
There's nothing inherently wrong with a tricky level. It can always be good to have an amount of challenge that, well, actually challenges you. Whether that's a tricky puzzle, an intense boss fight, or some pitch-perfect platforming. Of course, challenge is a balancing act, trying to make sure players of various skill levels need to illustrate their expertise with the game systems without creating a brick wall they'll just be bashing their heads against is an art. An art that not every developer nails all of the time. On this list, we're taking a look at some levels, and yes, I've snuck in some boss fights, bitchy locations, and exhausting missions in here too, that were so awful they almost made you quit the game you were playing, and maybe video games altogether. Some of them are just that bad. Now, we've dug into levels like this before on previous lists, but I mean, video games keep serving them up, so we'll keep telling you about them. I'm Jess from What Culture, and here are 10 more levels that almost made you quit video games. Number 10, Manaan, Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic. Beginning with a level that is technically one mission on a larger planet, we have Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic's Manaan. Specifically, we have the ocean walking on Manaan. If you've fallen victim to what can only be described as the most agonizingly slow traversal in an early 2000s video game, you won't need any other explanation here than underwater walking in Manaan. But for the rest of you, let's take a very slow walk down painful memory lane. Painting in stark contrast to what is otherwise one of the greatest RPGs of all time, you're at one point required to don an environment suit and search the sea floor area to complete main and side mission objectives. This is a totally intriguing concept, and Manaan itself is one of the more exciting planets, with its Selkath population, complex government, gorgeous vistas, and compelling investigation mission. Then there's walking on the seafloor, an initially interesting prospect that turns horrible as soon as you figure out that your speed is slower than even you would ever move underwater. It doesn't help that the seafloor isn't exactly a small area to explore either, and it's riddled with shark-esque beasties called Faraxa that you can only attack with a sonic gun. All of a sudden, you don't feel so much rewarded for exploration, but punished for it, as going too far in an empty location will require awkwardly shuffling all the way back. What you can do is cast your speed force power before you get out there to go a bit faster, and the bonus there is you will do a very entertaining super speed shuffle, but if you didn't know that hack, this one will bring back bad memories. Number 9, The Race, Mafia. By all reports, this one was vastly improved after initial patches and in the definitive edition that came out in 2020. But back in 2002, this one was about as fun as shoving bamboo down your fingernails. Sorry for the visual. In the Fair Play story mission, you're required to sub in for an injured driver and win the Grand Prix in order to progress to the next level. In case you missed it, this is indeed a story-related level and not an optional race, so it's pretty much guaranteed to be a bad time for everybody. Before PC patches and the aforementioned definitive edition chilled things out, this race was absolutely brutal. Essentially, your 50s race car handles like a nightmare, so your chances of winning this one are low, and your chances of quitting and never even completing the game because of it are high. There are plenty of tips to help you out now, but this one's going to bring back awful memories if you tried to play it at launch. If you got through this one without needing to replace your keyboard and/or mouse, then you are better than us. Number 8, Maggot Lair, Diablo II. There are a couple of classes that won't have the world's worth time in Diablo 2's Maggot Lair. For example, maybe you're a paladin with lightning resist, or you're buddied up with one. Or maybe you're not, and you have no lightning resistance, and you're about to have a really crappy time. While there are hindsight hacks like going counterclockwise to progress more quickly, if you didn't seek out tips beforehand, you'll be subjected to this claustrophobic insect and worm-riddled hellhole. There are 4 floors of this hellhole, and not only is it absent of joy and horrible enough to make you want to put down yet another of the greatest RPGs of all time, for all time, the tedium doesn't even stop there. As we touched on, one of the worst aspects of this particular level is the scarab enemies, who dole out waves of unavoidable lightning attacks that you might be able to sidestep were it not for the location, which consists of almost exclusively the world's skiddiest corridors. The whole thing sucks. Let's move on. Number 7, Elysium, Hades. On our last list, we included the Temple of Styx from Hades, but you guys were pretty adamant that after managing to make it through Elysium, especially the boss fight that pits you against both Theseus and Asterius at the same time, you look pretty much ready to handle anything. While the poison was absolutely a barrier for a lot of players during the Temple of Styx, Elysium being earlier in the game means you were probably less equipped and geared up to handle it, and that's why most players felt worse about that than the Temple. As a result, you'll be less able to handle all it has to throw at you. And what it has to throw at you is the exalted shield dudes, tiny flame chariots, regular chariots, butterfly balls, and that's all before you hit those bosses at the end ready to clean your clock, assuming you made it through all the waves of mobs. It's a fantastic exercise in proving how well you've built your character, but for the majority, as proved by Reddit polls, this level and its bosses proved far and away the most exhaustingly difficult in the game. The underlings, the bosses, the oppressive length, this whole area is a brutal exercise that will either take you down or make you more than prepared for everything else the game has to offer. Number 6, Yahweh's Universe, Shin Megami Tensei 4 Apocalypse. Dungeon design is one of the trickiest forms of level design. You want a sprawling area with challenging yet surmountable enemies and environmental puzzles all housed in an aesthetically interesting area. So it's no great surprise that often games don't get it right. Enter Yahweh's Universe in Shin Megami Tensei 4, a confusing labyrinth that drowns you in a tedious and uninteresting maze before hitting you with one of the best boss battles in the whole game. While that might seem like a pot of gold at the end of a rainbow, it's really more like a pot of gold at the end of a needlessly huge and obtuse dungeon, replete with confusing teleportation, terminals, dull ambient music, and way too many grindy encounters. It's initially aesthetically wild and interesting, but the novelty wears off, and the relentless pounding and shrieking of the soundtrack puts you into a sensory overload, where you fall into that if everything is intense, nothing is intense mode. Cool game, great final fight, terrible level. Number 5, Sewers, Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines. Most of the games on this list are absolute bangers, including this one, but they're here to show that even a wonderful game can contain a crap level. Or conversely, if you prefer, even a crap level can't bring down the ultimate enjoyment of a wonderful game. Although they definitely try. The sewer level in Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines is one such level. If you haven't rolled a melee fighter, you're gonna have a rough time taking on pretty much everything. From the tiny nasties to the hulking ones, all of which are dedicated to taking a bite out of you. At the bare minimum, you're gonna want to go in with every blood bag and bullet you can get your hands on to make it out alive. Assuming you manage to either turn invisible and sneak your way through, or brute force your way through, you're still left with a visually uninteresting, sprawling labyrinth of a sewer that's just no fun at all. In most video games, sewer levels are a drag, and if there's one thing we can say for this entry, at least it's keeping with the trend. Number 4, Cathedral of Sacred Blood, Code Vein. Now, there's something important you need to understand about the lore of the Cathedral of the Sacred Blood in the 2019 action game Code Vein. And let me be clear, this little tidbit of lore does explain why this one's so tedious, but it does not excuse it. The location was deliberately designed within the lore of the game to be a twisting and complicated mess to navigate, in order to prevent people from reaching the cathedral. Well, you certainly couldn't say they failed at that. Unfortunately, you're a person who wants to reach the cathedral, so welcome to one of the most irritating areas in video games. Even with a guide, this one is horrific to find your way around, so that's really saying something. It's riddled with tough enemies, it's enormous, and it comes with a fun break in the middle where you play through a flashback before getting chucked right back in. There are multiple bosses, and there's also a bunch of loot you want to pick up here so you can improve your gear and skills and get the good ending, so you can't even hurry your way through. It's initially quite pretty, but eventually everything looks the same and there are holes galore you can fall into that kill you instantly, just to top up the pain. Speaking of pain, let's drop into the next entry. Number 3, A Brother's Fate, Brothers: A Tale of Two Sons. You'll notice that while we've done lists in the past about levels that made you rage quit or were so terrible you wanted to stop playing altogether, this list is a little more ambiguous as to what it is that's making you want to quit. In this case, it's a level that made you really devastated. Now, this entry includes spoilers for Brothers: A Tale of Two Sons, a game that I have implored you to play before and continue to, So if you don't want spoilers, go meet me over at number 2. Otherwise, let's talk about sad stuff. Brothers: A Tale of Two Sons is the first game from It Takes Two developer Joseph Fares. It's a gorgeous adventure that takes two brothers on a wild and dangerous journey to seek a cure for their ailing father. Amongst the trials and tribulations the pair manage to surpass and overcome, a betrayal from what was assumed to be an ally results in the older brother's untimely death. After trying your best to save him in time, it ends up being too late. Your race to save your brother, the swell of the mournful soundtrack, and the younger brother's heartbreaking cries and screams as he's realized what has happened is enough to make you want to quit altogether. Not to mention literally having to dig his grave. There's also a cheeky insert where you see the older brother hugging the younger brother and it seems like everything's somehow okay, but then it pans around to the side and his corpse is on the ground. So, anyway, I'm getting a little sad. Let's talk about bad levels again. Number 2, Climbing Sector 7 Slums Pillar, Final Fantasy VII Remake. Final Fantasy VII Remake is pretty inarguably fantastic as both a remake and a game in its own right. When Wedge is on the brink of death in Chapter 12 and Aerith says she'll stay behind and help heal him, Cloud sets off to climb the pillar and prevent Shinra from dropping the plate. While the game has been fairly accused of padding its runtime, including a bunch of sections that don't really add anything to the overall experience, this is a good example of that. Even the security officers you encounter and then maim say they're getting sick of it, and that pretty much sums up the way climbing approximately 1 zillion stairs feels. There are some heavy moments between the respective fates of Jesse and Biggs, but their impact is undercut by the level's pacing, an issue that wasn't a case in the original. The heli troopers are a particular pain in the butt since, although you can zip up to them, you're primarily a hand-to-sword kind of guy, so you won't be doing as much damage or getting in as many hits as you wish you were. Not only that, but sometimes they fly out of the arena and away from the stairwell, so you just have to wait for them to float back to you. The whole climbing exercise should be epic, but it drags on for way too long. Eventually Tifa joins you, and to her credit, she gets up those stairs way quicker than Cloud, so he might want to consider not skipping leg day. Then again, now you have 2 melee characters against multiple flying enemy types, and a helicopter shooting at you relentlessly, so yeah, cool. Number 1, Gates Laboratory Levels, Mega Man X6. There are loads of notoriously unpopular and brutal levels in the Mega Man series, most of which came from the X series. While we're spoiled for choice in options here, we've given our top slot to the half-baked and infamously frustrating Mega Man X6. Honestly, the whole game is end-to-end pain, but perhaps the worst level of all is Gates Laboratory. To wrap this one up, here are all the things that are bad about it. And if you think this is going to be a short and sweet entry with a little list of a couple of irritations, you'd be sorely mistaken. Let's go. The stage is way too long for one, the initial area is caked in spikes that will kill you instantly, the enemy types are some of the nastiest the game has to offer, like Monbandos who can shield from damage, there are some near impossible areas to traverse without dying, especially with basic X, the mini-boss can only be hurt by a very specific combat approach, and the final boss kicks off between a bunch of tiny platforms that you'll need to hop between while trying to hit Gate with his own projectiles, and even if you do start to hurt him, he'll begin destroying the platforms. And yet it is still somehow more infuriating than I've managed to describe it. It's enough to make you want to give up on video games altogether, or if not that, at least Mega Man X6.